Dr. Melissa Grant's research vessel had been due back at the port of Valdez 3 days ago. The marine biology professor from Oregon State University had embarked on what should have been a routine 2-week expedition to catalog kelp forest ecosystems along Alaska's remote southeastern coastline. Her colleagues assumed she'd simply extended her research window. Melissa was known for losing track of time when she discovered something fascinating beneath the waves. What they didn't know was that their 34-year-old colleague was fighting for survival on an unnamed island barely visible on nautical charts, her boat destroyed on jagged rocks during an unexpected storm, her emergency beacon shattered in the wreck. The island measured roughly 2 miles long and half a mile wide, a windswept piece of volcanic rock covered in dense Sitka spruce forest and surrounded by frigid Pacific waters. Melissa had managed to swim to shore with her waterproof research pack, but the hypothermia had nearly killed her that first night. Now, as dawn broke on her 4th day stranded, she assessed her situation with the methodical precision that had earned her a doctorate. Her satellite phone had been aboard the vessel, her flares were gone. The nearest shipping lane was at least 40 miles south. The November temperatures were dropping toward freezing each night. If you're enjoying this incredible survival story, please subscribe to our channel and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. We love connecting with viewers around the world. She had approximately 70 hours of remaining daylight before the Alaskan winter truly set in. Melissa knew the statistics. At these water temperatures, search and rescue operations typically focused on recovery rather than rescue after 48 hours. But she also knew something else. The tide pools along this island's western shore contained thousands of hermit crabs, and the forest provided materials for shelter. Her graduate advisor at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution had once told her that marine biologists made excellent survivors because they understood ecosystems as interconnected systems rather than isolated components. She intended to prove him right. The first challenge was water, and Melissa approached it with scientific methodology. She fashioned a collection system using her empty sample containers, positioning them beneath spruce branches to catch condensation and the frequent drizzle that swept across the island. The containers were clear plastic, allowing her to monitor water quality visually. Any cloudiness or discoloration would indicate contamination. She found a small freshwater seep near the island's northern cliff face, where snowmelt trickled through moss-covered rocks. The taste was metallic, tinged with minerals leached from the volcanic substrate, but her knowledge of geology told her these minerals were benign, primarily iron and magnesium. She marked the location with a cairn of white stones, then created a trail system using stripped bark tied to branches, markings she could follow even in the perpetual twilight of Alaskan November evenings. Food proved more complex and required her to overcome years of viewing marine life as research subjects rather than sustenance. The hermit crabs were abundant in the intertidal zone. She estimated their population density at approximately 200 individuals per square meter during low tide. They belonged primarily to the species Pagurus hirsutiusculus, the hairy hermit crab, creatures she'd studied extensively but never considered eating. The thought made her queasy initially, but hunger proved a powerful motivator. The crabs required cooking to eliminate potential parasites, particularly nematodes, common in crustaceans, from cold waters. Melissa spent an entire day constructing a fire pit from beach stones, carefully selecting rocks without water-filled pockets that might explode when heated. She used dried bull kelp as tinder. Its hollow structure made it extraordinarily flammable when desiccated, and her waterproof matches from the research pack. She had exactly 11 matches remaining. Each one needed to count. The crabs tasted like bitter seawater mixed with the iodine flavor of the algae they consumed, and they offered minimal calories, perhaps 20 per individual. but combined with edible kelp species she recognized from her research, particularly Alaria marginata with its high vitamin content, and the occasional mussels she pried from rocks during extreme low tides. They provided enough nutrition to keep her metabolic processes functioning. She established a feeding schedule based on tidal patterns, harvesting during the twice-daily low tides when the greatest biodiversity of edible species became accessible. Her scientific training allowed her to identify safe species while avoiding toxic varieties. She knew that certain mussels accumulated paralytic shellfish toxins during algal blooms, and she carefully examined each specimen for the telltale reddish discoloration that indicated contamination. By day 7, Melissa had established a survival routine that bordered on ritualistic: wake at first light, check water collection containers, rebuild the fire if it had died overnight, a process that consumed precious matches if she'd been careless. Harvest breakfast during the morning low tide, typically 20 to 30 hermit crabs plus kelp. Spend midday hours improving her shelter or exploring the island for additional resources. Afternoon low tide meant another harvest. Evenings were devoted to processing food, maintaining equipment, and treating the injuries that accumulated daily. But her body was weakening despite these efforts. She'd lost nearly 15 pounds, her cheekbones becoming prominent in a face that had always been round. The constant cold had given her a persistent cough that rattled in her chest each morning, a sound she recognized as potentially indicating bronchitis or early pneumonia. Her hands were covered in cuts from prying shellfish off rocks. The barnacles were particularly vicious, their calcium carbonate shells sharp as razor blades. 2 of her fingers showed early signs of infection, the tissue around the wounds becoming red and swollen despite her attempts to clean them with boiled seawater. She needed rescue, but the skies remained stubbornly overcast and no aircraft passed overhead. The island's position in a narrow strait between larger landmasses meant boat traffic was virtually non-existent. Commercial captains avoided these waters specifically because of the treacherous rocks and unpredictable currents that had destroyed her vessel. She was invisible to the world, her disappearance now over a week old. At Oregon State, her department chair would be fielding calls from concerned students. Her sister in Portland would be frantic, demanding answers from Coast Guard officials who had no answers to give. Her ex-husband would probably learn about it from news reports, if it even made the news. The thought of people mourning her while she was still alive felt surreal, like attending her own funeral. On day 12, everything changed. Melissa was checking her makeshift fishing traps, woven structures she'd created from flexible willow branches and kelp strands, designed based on traditional indigenous techniques she'd read about in anthropological papers. When she noticed something unusual in the tidal patterns, the water was behaving strangely, pulling back farther than normal, exposing sections of seafloor she hadn't seen before. Tide pools that normally remained submerged were completely exposed, revealing substrate that should have been underwater even during spring tides. Her scientific training immediately recognized the signs. A significant storm system was approaching, possibly a bomb cyclone forming over the Gulf of Alaska. These meteorological phenomena occurred when atmospheric pressure dropped at least 24 millibars in 24 hours, creating storms with intensity comparable to hurricanes. The resulting winds could exceed 70 miles per hour, and waves could reach heights of 40 feet or more. Her small island, with its highest point barely 60 feet above sea level, would be completely exposed to the onslaught. Panic threatened to overwhelm her rational thinking, adrenaline flooding her system and making her hands shake. But Melissa forced herself to breathe slowly, counting inhalations and exhalations, using the mindfulness techniques her therapist had taught her during the divorce. Think like a scientist, she told herself. Break the problem into manageable components. She had perhaps 18 hours before the storm hit, based on the barometric pressure changes she could feel in her sinuses and the behavior of the seabirds, which had abandoned their usual roosting sites and fled inland. Her current shelter, a lean-to constructed against a fallen spruce trunk using smaller branches and sheets of bark, wouldn't survive winds above 40 miles per hour. The structure was functional for normal conditions, but fundamentally inadequate for what was coming. She needed to find or create something more substantial, somewhere that could protect her from both wind and the storm surge that would inevitably flood the lower elevations of the island, potentially reaching 20 feet above normal high tide levels. She spent the next 6 hours in frantic exploration, pushing deeper into the island's interior than she'd dared venture before. The forest grew denser here, with devil's club thorns tearing at her waterproof jacket. The plant's spines contained irritant compounds that made even minor scratches burn intensely, and western hemlock branches creating a canopy so thick that even midday felt like twilight. The undergrowth was a tangle of salmonberry bushes and ferns, each step requiring careful navigation. Then she found it, a natural cave formation in the volcanic rock, about 30 feet above current sea level, based on her estimation of the slope gradient, its entrance partially hidden by a massive fallen cedar that had toppled decades earlier. The cave was shallow, maybe 10 feet deep and 6 feet high at its maximum height, but the rock overhead was solid basalt, capable of withstanding tremendous force. The floor was dry, covered in centuries of accumulated spruce needles and the desiccated remains of small mammals that had used the space as a den. Melissa worked through the afternoon and into the evening, her body protesting with every trip as she hauled her meager supplies to the cave. She gathered every piece of dry wood she could find, prioritizing fallen branches that had been dead long enough to lose most of their moisture content, but not so long that they'd begun to rot. She stacked the wood deep inside the cave where the rain couldn't reach, creating a fuel reserve that might last a week if she was careful. She relocated her water collection system, positioning containers at the cave's entrance where runoff from the rock face above would fill them quickly during the storm. She even managed to transport several dozen live hermit crabs in her sample jars, knowing she'd need food reserves if the storm lasted multiple days and made shore access impossible. Each crab represented potential calories, potential survival. By the time the first warning winds began shaking the spruce tops, creating a sound like distant thunder, she had created a survival cache that would have impressed any emergency preparedness expert, a small fortress against the coming chaos. The storm hit just after midnight on day 13, announcing its arrival with a pressure change so sudden that Melissa's ears popped painfully. She had experienced rough seas during research expeditions, had even weathered a Force 9 gale off the coast of Vancouver Island during her postdoctoral work. But nothing had prepared her for the raw violence of an Alaskan bomb cyclone. The wind screamed through the forest like a living thing, a sound that transcended normal weather and became something primal and terrifying. Trees began snapping with sounds like rifle shots, the cracks echoing through the darkness. Rain fell horizontally, driven by gusts that Melissa estimated exceeded 80 miles per hour based on the Beaufort scale descriptions she'd memorized. She huddled in the deepest part of her cave, a small fire burning near the entrance providing just enough heat to prevent hypothermia, and listened to her island being torn apart. The sound was apocalyptic, wind roar punctuated by the crash of falling trees, the thunder of waves striking rocks with force that made the ground vibrate, the occasional metallic shriek of her abandoned shelter being destroyed. She couldn't see anything beyond the cave entrance, the world reduced to sound and fury and the desperate hope that the rock above her head would hold. The storm lasted 37 hours, a period that felt simultaneously endless and dreamlike. Melissa drifted in and out of an exhausted semi-consciousness, waking periodically to feed the fire and sip water, her mind occasionally playing tricks on her. She thought she heard her sister calling her name, heard the throb of helicopter rotors that weren't there. When she finally emerged into weak daylight, her legs shaking from disuse and malnutrition, the landscape had been transformed beyond recognition. Entire sections of forest had been flattened, trees lying in tangled rows like scattered matchsticks, their root systems torn from the earth and exposed to the air. The western beach where she'd been harvesting shellfish had disappeared entirely, replaced by a new geography of boulder fields and exposed bedrock. Storm surge had redesigned the coastline, moving tons of material and creating entirely new tidal pools. Her original shelter was gone, swept away as if it had never existed. But she had survived, and in surviving she'd learned something crucial about both the island and herself. She was capable of enduring far more than she'd ever imagined possible. By day 16, Melissa had developed a new strategy based on careful observation and her evolving understanding of the island's relationship to human activity. The storm had altered the island's topography dramatically, but it had also exposed something interesting. Sections of the northwestern shore now showed signs of relatively recent human activity, artifacts that had been buried under sand and vegetation. She found a rusted fuel can partially buried in the newly exposed substrate, its faded label indicating it had contained diesel fuel, the type used in marine engines. Chemical analysis would have revealed its age precisely, but visual inspection suggested it was perhaps 5 to 10 years old, based on the corrosion patterns. She discovered nylon rope fragments caught in the rocks, the bright orange color characteristic of commercial fishing gear, the fibers still maintaining some structural integrity despite prolonged exposure to saltwater and UV radiation. Most significantly, she found a weathered wooden post driven into the ground above the high tide line, its placement too deliberate to be natural, marking what might have been a temporary mooring point or a navigation aid used by boats seeking shelter during storms. Someone had been here before, probably within the last decade, and likely for purposes related to fishing operations. And if fishing boats had used this island as a waypoint or emergency shelter, they might return. Melissa's scientific mind began calculating probabilities, applying the same statistical reasoning she used in her research. The November season was late for most commercial fishing operations. The majority of the fleet returned to port by October. But crab fishermen often worked through December, especially in years when quotas hadn't been met early in the season. King crab and tanner crab seasons could extend into winter months, depending on stock assessments and market conditions. The storm might have pushed some boats further north than usual, captains seeking shelter in protected waters rather than risking the open ocean during such extreme conditions. If she could make her presence known to any passing vessel, even one several miles offshore, operating at the edge of her visual range, she might have a chance at rescue. But this required making herself visible across miles of ocean, a challenge that demanded creative problem-solving. She spent the next 3 days constructing the most elaborate signal system she could devise with the limited materials available on the island. Using rocks she painted with crushed charcoal mixed with water to create a dark pigment, she created large SOS letters on the highest open ground she could access, a rocky outcrop on the island's southern end that rose approximately 50 feet above sea level. Each letter measured roughly 10 feet tall, large enough to be potentially visible from aircraft if any happened to fly over, though she knew the odds of aerial traffic were minimal. She fashioned reflectors from the aluminum base of her sample containers, carefully cutting and flattening the metal to create surfaces that would catch sunlight. She hung these from trees at various elevations, creating a network of potential signal points that would flash when light hit them at the correct angles. Most ambitiously, she began weaving a massive net structure from vines, kelp, and strips of fabric she cut from her nylon jacket, sacrificing the garment's waterproofing for the possibility of rescue. The net construction consumed 3 full days and represented perhaps the most physically demanding work of her entire ordeal. She harvested vines from the forest floor, selecting species with the appropriate tensile strength, primarily trailing blackberry despite its thorns, which provided excellent durability. She collected kelp during low tides, choosing the longest specimens of bull kelp, with their characteristic hollow stipes that could reach lengths of over 40 feet. She cut strips from her jacket using a sharp rock, creating bright blue ribbons of nylon that contrasted starkly against the dark vegetation. Then she wove these materials together using a combination of knots she'd learned during sailing courses and improvised bindings, creating a construction that resembled a giant spider web stretched between 2 tall spruce trees positioned near the shoreline. The net was bright blue against the dark forest, its surface area approximately 20 feet by 15 feet, potentially visible for a mile or more from the water, especially when the sun hit it directly. It was probably futile. The odds of a boat passing close enough to see it were astronomically small, but it gave her purpose, a project that required her to think beyond simple survival and toward active rescue. The work was exhausting and consumed calories she could barely afford to spend, but it transformed her mental state. Each morning, Melissa would check her signals with the thoroughness of a scientist conducting an experiment, repair any damage from overnight winds, and add improvements. She'd lost track of how many hermit crabs she'd consumed, dozens certainly, possibly hundreds, their empty shells accumulating in a pile near her cave that grew daily. Her body had adapted to the meager diet with disturbing efficiency, her metabolism slowing to conserve energy, her muscle tissue gradually being catabolized to provide the amino acids needed for essential functions. She'd punched 2 new holes in her belt to keep her cargo pants from falling off her shrinking frame. The infection in her fingers had worsened despite her attempts to clean the wounds with boiled salt water, the tissue becoming increasingly inflamed and tender. She knew basic emergency medicine, every field researcher did, and recognized the signs of advancing cellulitis that could progress to systemic sepsis if left untreated. She was running out of time, her body's resources depleting faster than she could replenish them through foraging. On day 23, Melissa woke to clear skies for the first time in over a week. The transformation, so sudden it felt almost supernatural. The November sun felt almost warm against her face as she performed her morning routine with mechanical precision. Check water collection containers, tend the fire that she now maintained continuously to avoid wasting matches, inspect signal systems for storm damage, harvest breakfast from the tide pools during the morning low tide. She had developed an unexpected appreciation for the island's harsh beauty, despite everything it had put her through. The way morning light transformed the spruce needles into silver threads, each one catching the sun and creating thousands of tiny points of illumination. The haunting calls of ravens echoing through the forest, their complex vocalizations suggesting an intelligence that researchers were only beginning to understand. The mathematical precision of tide pool ecosystems, each creature playing its role in maintaining equilibrium. The sea stars controlling mussel populations, the hermit crabs serving as detritivores, the kelp providing structure and habitat. If she weren't slowly dying here, her body consuming itself for fuel, she might have found the experience spiritually profound, a forced meditation on humanity's relationship with natural systems. She was repairing her vine net. A wind gust had torn loose one corner, the kelp strands having dried and become brittle, when she heard it. The sound was so faint she initially dismissed it as imagination, or the audio hallucinations that had become increasingly common as malnutrition affected her neurological function. But then it came again, unmistakable. The distant throb of a diesel engine, that characteristic rhythmic pulse that distinguished commercial fishing vessels from other boat types. Melissa's heart began hammering as she scrambled down from the tree, her weakened muscles protesting, nearly falling in her haste and catching herself on a branch that tore another cut in her already damaged hands. She raced to the southern outcrop on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else, her cardiovascular system so deconditioned that even this short sprint left her gasping. Her eyes scanned the horizon with desperate intensity, searching the grey expanse of ocean for any sign of human presence. There, maybe 3 miles offshore, possibly closer but difficult to judge without instruments, a fishing vessel was moving slowly southward, its white hull barely visible against the grey ocean, distinguished primarily by the vertical lines of its masts and the dark smudge of exhaust from its stack. The boat appeared to be a mid-sized commercial fishing vessel, probably 50 to 70 feet in length, based on the proportions, the type that worked the Alaska crab fishery. It was following a course parallel to the island, not approaching but not moving away either, maintaining a consistent distance from the hazardous rocks that surrounded her prison. Melissa grabbed her largest reflector, a section of aluminum approximately 8 inches square that she'd polished with sand until it gleamed, and began signaling frantically, angling the metal to catch the weak sunlight and flash it toward the boat. She understood basic principles of optical signaling from her sailing experience. Rapid flashes in groups of 3, repeated continuously, the international distress signal. She screamed until her voice went hoarse, though she knew sound wouldn't carry across that distance, the ocean wind and engine noise making acoustic signaling useless. The vessel continued its course, showing no sign of deviation, no indication that anyone aboard had noticed the flashing light, or the bright blue net, or the SOS painted on rocks. It was going to pass without seeing her. 23 days of survival, of eating hermit crabs and building fires and enduring storms and fighting infections. And her chance at rescue was slipping away like sand through her fingers, disappearing into the vast indifference of the ocean. Then she remembered the magnesium, not the emergency flares that had gone down with her boat, but something else entirely. Her research pack contained magnesium strips used for chemical analysis, specifically for water quality testing, where the magnesium served as a reducing agent in certain analytical procedures. She'd been conserving them for some imagined future emergency. But this was that emergency. This was everything. This was the moment that would determine whether she lived or died on this island. Magnesium burned at over 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit when ignited, producing an intensely bright white flame that was visible for miles, used in military flares and emergency signals precisely because of its visibility. She had 3 strips remaining, each approximately 6 inches long and a 1/4 inch wide. Melissa sprinted back to her cave, her exhausted body finding reserves of energy she didn't know remained, adrenaline overriding the weakness and pain. She grabbed the magnesium strips and her last 3 matches, then raced back to the outcrop, her lungs burning and her vision narrowing at the edges from the exertion. Her hands were shaking so badly she nearly dropped the first match, her fine motor control compromised by malnutrition and cold exposure. "Breathe," she told herself, forcing air slowly in and out. "You've done delicate lab work under pressure. You've pipetted microliters of solution while a boat pitched in rough seas. You can do this. You have to do this." She struck the match against the rock, cupped it carefully against the wind that threatened to extinguish it, and touched the flame to the first magnesium strip. The resulting flare was spectacular beyond anything she'd anticipated. A blazing white light that seared her retinas even when she looked away, creating after-images that persisted for minutes. The magnesium hissed and sputtered as it oxidized, producing white smoke and a heat so intense she had to hold the strip at arm's length to avoid burning her hand. She held it aloft for 30 seconds until the metal was consumed entirely, then immediately lit the second strip and finally the third, creating a sequence of 3 brilliant stars burning against the Alaskan wilderness, impossible to miss for anyone looking in this direction, a signal that screamed human presence with undeniable urgency. She watched the fishing vessel with an intensity that made her eyes water, praying to any god who might be listening. The Christian god of her childhood, the Buddhist concepts she'd explored in college, the animistic spirits that indigenous peoples believed inhabited these islands. Please, she thought, please see me. Please turn around. And then she saw the most beautiful sight of her life. The boat's profile was changing. It was turning. The vessel was altering course, its bow swinging toward the island, creating a wake that was visible even from this distance. Someone had seen her flares. Someone was coming. The vessel was the Pacific Dawn, a 60-foot crab fishing boat out of Sitka, its hull bearing the scars of decades working Alaska's brutal waters, dents from collisions with ice, rust stains where paint had been scoured away by waves, repairs welded over previous repairs. The boat was captained by Frank Walters, a third-generation fisherman whose grandfather had emigrated from Norway in 1948 and established the family's fishing operation. Frank had been working these waters for 40 years, since he was 14 years old, and his father first allowed him to handle the wheel during calm weather. He'd survived storms that sank other vessels, had pulled drowning men from the ocean, had witnessed the Alaska fishing industry transform from a frontier enterprise into a regulated, quota-based system. His 2-person crew consisted of his son David, 28 years old and learning the family business, and Luis Garcia, a deckhand who'd previously served in the Coast Guard before transitioning to commercial fishing. They'd been running late after mechanical troubles delayed their departure from Sitka, a hydraulic line failure that required emergency repairs and cost them 2 days of fishing time. They'd chosen a more northern route than usual, hoping to make up time by accessing crab grounds that other boats had already abandoned for the season, accepting the additional risk of working in more remote waters. David had been at the wheel when he spotted what he initially thought was a lightning strike on the unnamed island they'd been passing, an unusual phenomenon for November, but not impossible. "Dad, you seeing that?" David had called from the wheelhouse, grabbing the binoculars they kept mounted near the navigation station. "Something's flashing on that rock pile 3 times. It just happened again." Frank had been below deck checking the engine oil levels, but he climbed to the wheelhouse immediately, his instincts from 4 decades at sea telling him this was significant. He took the binoculars and scanned the island, seeing nothing initially, then catching a glimpse of something blue among the trees, unnatural against the forest colors. "Come about," he ordered. "Slow approach. Luis, get up here." And Frank altered course immediately, his hands moving over the controls with practiced efficiency. In all his years fishing these waters, he'd participated in 4 rescues of people from various maritime disasters, and he knew that unusual lights on uninhabited islands meant only one thing: someone needed help desperately. The fact that someone was using magnesium flares suggested they understood maritime signaling, which meant they were likely experienced with boats and had been stranded long enough to exhaust conventional options. As the Pacific Dawn approached, reducing speed to navigate the treacherous waters, they spotted Melissa on the outcrop, waving both arms above her head, her movements weak but persistent, her body so thin she looked like she might collapse at any moment. Frank immediately radioed the Coast Guard on Channel 16, the international distress frequency. "Coast Guard Juneau, this is fishing vessel Pacific Dawn. We have visual confirmation of a distressed person on unnamed island approximately 40 nautical miles southeast of Sitka. Single individual appears to be in need of medical attention, requesting helicopter evacuation. Over." The response came within 30 seconds. "Pacific Dawn, Coast Guard Juneau. Copy your traffic. Can you provide GPS coordinates? Over." Frank read off the coordinates from his navigation system while David and Luis prepared to launch their inflatable tender, a 14-foot Zodiac with a 30-horsepower outboard motor. Getting Melissa off the island would prove challenging. The same rocks that had destroyed her research vessel created a maze of hazards for any approaching craft, with submerged obstacles that could puncture the Zodiac's rubber hull or damage the propeller. Frank navigated with extreme caution, using his depth finder and years of experience reading water conditions to find a safe approach angle, looking for the subtle color changes that indicated deeper channels between the rocks. Luis, who had completed Coast Guard rescue swimmer training during his previous career before leaving the service due to a back injury, went ashore in the tender with David operating the outboard. They beached the Zodiac on a small patch of gravel, pulling it up above the tide line to prevent it from drifting away. Luis approached Melissa, who was now sitting on the ground, her legs having finally given out. Up close, her condition was even more alarming than it had appeared from the boat. Her face was gaunt, her eyes sunken, her exposed skin covered in cuts and bruises in various stages of healing, her hands showing obvious signs of infection, with red streaks extending up her forearms, indicating potential blood poisoning. "I'm a marine biologist," Melissa kept repeating as Luis helped her to her feet, her mind struggling to process that rescue was actually happening, that this wasn't another hallucination or dream from which she'd wake up still alone. Oregon State University. I study kelp ecosystems. 28 days. I've been here 28 days. I ate hermit crabs. So many hermit crabs. I built nets from vines. Luis wrapped her in thermal blankets, the metallized emergency type that reflected body heat, and gave her small sips of water from his canteen. She wanted to gulp it, her throat raw and desperate for hydration. But he knew rehydration needed to be gradual to avoid potentially fatal complications from refeeding syndrome, a condition that occurred when nutrition was restored too quickly after prolonged starvation. "You're safe now," he told her, his voice steady and professional despite the shock of seeing someone in such desperate condition. "We've got you. Coast Guard helicopter is inbound from Sitka, ETA 40 minutes. They'll take you to the hospital. You're going to be fine. You survived. You did everything right." Getting Melissa to the tender required careful assistance. She couldn't walk unassisted, her muscles too weak and her balance compromised. David and Luis supported her on either side, moving slowly across the rocky terrain to avoid further injury. They loaded her into the Zodiac along with her research pack, which she insisted on bringing despite Luis's suggestion that they leave it behind. "My data," she said, "my notebooks, everything from before." They understood. These items represented her professional identity, her connection to the person she'd been before the island transformed her. The trip back to the Pacific Dawn took only minutes, but felt longer as they navigated between rocks, with Luis carefully monitoring their depth. Aboard the fishing vessel, Frank's weathered face showed rare emotion as he looked at the emaciated woman huddled in blankets on his deck, shivering despite the thermal wraps. He'd seen commercial fishermen who'd survived days in life rafts, had pulled hypothermic kayakers from the water, but 28 days alone on an uninhabited island with no supplies represented a survival ordeal beyond anything in his experience. 28 days, he muttered to David, shaking his head in disbelief. "Longest I ever heard of someone lasting out here was 11 days, and that was a guy with survival gear. How'd you manage it?" Melissa managed a weak smile, her cracked lips splitting slightly with the expression. "Hermit crabs," she said, her voice hoarse from screaming and dehydration. "Thousands of hermit crabs, Pagurus hirsutiusculus mostly, and I built fishing traps from willow branches, collected water from a seep, found a cave before the storm hit, used my marine biology training to identify safe food sources." She paused, coughing. "I'm never eating seafood again for as long as I live." The Coast Guard helicopter arrived from Sitka Air Station in 38 minutes, its distinctive orange and white paint scheme visible long before the rotor noise became audible over the ocean wind. The Sikorsky MH-60 Jayhawk circled once, the pilots assessing the Pacific Dawn's position and the sea conditions, then moved into position for the rescue. The rotor wash created whitecaps on the ocean surface and made the fishing boat rock in the suddenly turbulent water. A rescue swimmer was lowered on a cable with a rescue litter basket, the rigid type used for injured or incapacitated survivors who couldn't use the simpler horse collar harness. The rescue swimmer, whose name tape read Johnson, conducted a rapid medical assessment, checking Melissa's vital signs and level of consciousness, asking basic questions to evaluate her mental status. Do you know where you are? Do you know what day it is? Any chest pain or difficulty breathing besides the cough? Melissa answered as best she could, though she'd lost track of dates and wasn't entirely certain whether this was late November or early December. Johnson strapped her into the litter basket, securing her carefully with multiple restraint systems to prevent her from falling during the ascent. "We're going to lift you up now," he explained. "It's going to be loud and windy. Keep your eyes closed if it helps. Just relax and let the equipment do the work." As Melissa rose into the air, the cable reeling in smoothly, she looked down at the island that had been both her prison and her proving ground. The place where she'd discovered exactly how much strength and resourcefulness she possessed when everything else was stripped away. She could see her vine net still hanging between the trees, a monument to human persistence and creative problem-solving that would remain until the next major storm tore it down. She could see the cave entrance where she'd survived the bomb cyclone. She could see the rocky outcrop where she'd signaled with magnesium flares. The island looked smaller from this perspective, less threatening, just another piece of rock and forest in an archipelago of thousands. But she knew she'd never forget a single detail of its topography, the location of every freshwater source and tide pool and shelter, information burned into her memory by 28 days of intimate survival. Inside the helicopter, the crew immediately began advanced medical care, starting an IV line to begin careful rehydration, administering oxygen through a mask, wrapping her in additional warming blankets to address the hypothermia that she'd been fighting continuously for 4 weeks. The flight medic, a young woman who introduced herself as Petty Officer Chen, monitored Melissa's vital signs continuously while radioing ahead to Sitka Community Hospital to prepare the emergency department for a severe malnutrition and exposure case. BP is 90/60, heart rate 110, temperature 35.2 Celsius, oxygen saturation 92% on room air, she reported. Patient is alert and oriented, but showing signs of severe dehydration and probable infection. Multiple open wounds on hands and forearms with erythema and purulent drainage. The flight took 23 minutes, the helicopter traveling at maximum cruise speed. Melissa drifted in and out of awareness during the trip, her exhausted body finally allowing itself to truly rest now that rescue was complete. She had vague impressions of the medical crew working around her, of the helicopter's vibration and noise, of being unloaded onto a wheeled stretcher and moved through automatic doors into bright fluorescent lighting. At Sitka Community Hospital, the emergency department had assembled a team specifically for her arrival. Dr. Rebecca Patterson, the senior emergency physician, along with 2 nurses and a physician assistant. They'd been briefed on the basic situation during the helicopter's approach. Female, mid-30s, stranded for 28 days with minimal food or shelter, probable malnutrition and infection, unknown trauma history. What they found when examining Melissa exceeded even their worst expectations based on the radio report. She had lost 32 pounds from an already slim frame, reducing her body weight to a dangerous level where organ function began to be compromised. Her body mass index had dropped to approximately 16, well into the severely underweight category. She showed signs of multiple vitamin deficiencies. Scurvy from vitamin C deficiency, evidenced by bleeding gums and poor wound healing. Possible thiamine deficiency based on neurological symptoms. Probable vitamin D deficiency from limited sun exposure. The infections in her fingers had progressed to a stage requiring immediate intervention. Dr. Patterson ordered IV antibiotics and surgical consultation to determine whether debridement or more extensive treatment was necessary. Melissa was severely dehydrated despite her water collection efforts, her electrolyte balance disrupted in ways that required careful correction to avoid cardiac complications. But despite all this, her vital organs remained functional. Her kidneys were processing fluids, her liver enzymes were only mildly elevated, her heart rhythm was stable if rapid. Most remarkably, her mental state remained relatively intact. She could provide detailed accounts of her survival strategies, demonstrated clear memory and reasoning ability, showed no signs of the psychological deterioration that often accompanied prolonged isolation. Dr. Patterson, who'd practiced emergency medicine for 15 years, including time at a Level 1 trauma center in Seattle, told the nursing staff that Melissa's survival represented a testament to human adaptability and the practical value of specialized knowledge in crisis situations. Most people stranded like this make critical mistakes in the first 48 hours, she explained during her initial assessment. They panic, they waste energy on futile rescue attempts, they eat the wrong things or drink contaminated water. This woman applied scientific methodology to survival. She identified reliable food sources, established sustainable harvesting patterns, maintained fire and shelter, protected herself from the worst of that storm we had 2 weeks ago. Her marine biology background gave her knowledge that translated directly into survival skills most people wouldn't have. The hospital admitted Melissa to the intensive care unit for close monitoring during the critical first 72 hours of recovery, the period when refeeding complications were most likely to occur. Her nutrition was restored gradually through carefully calculated IV fluids first, then clear liquids, then soft foods, with continuous monitoring of her electrolytes and organ function. The infection in her hands responded well to IV antibiotics, though she would require several weeks of oral antibiotics after discharge and showed some permanent scarring. The frostbite damage to her toes was minor, requiring only conservative treatment. Physically, she would make a complete recovery given time. Melissa spent 11 days in the hospital, the first 3 in intensive care and the remaining 8 on a regular medical floor. Her colleagues from Oregon State University flew up to visit. Her department chair, her research partner, 2 graduate students she'd been mentoring. They brought flowers and chocolate and expressed relief that bordered on disbelief that their eccentric professor had survived such an ordeal. The university administration, which had been preparing memorial statements and discussing how to handle her research commitments, instead found themselves organizing a welcome-back celebration and handling media requests for interviews. The story captured national attention within days of her rescue. News outlets ran features about the Hermit crab professor, the headline appearing in dozens of newspapers and websites. Survival experts analyzed her techniques on television programs, praising her use of tide pool resources and her construction of the vine net signal. Frank Walters and his crew were honored by the Coast Guard with commendations for their quick response and skilled navigation in hazardous waters. Luis Garcia's photograph appeared on magazine covers, portrayed as a hero for his role in the rescue. The Pacific Dawn became briefly famous, with tourists in Sitka asking to see the boat that saved the stranded biologist. But for Melissa, the real story was far more personal and complex than the media narrative suggested. During her hospital recovery, she found herself processing not just the physical trauma of near death, but also the profound psychological and philosophical implications of her experience. She'd always been an observer of nature, studying ecosystems from a position of safety and academic distance, collecting data and writing papers about marine biology. 28 days of complete dependence on those ecosystems had transformed her understanding in ways no amount of research could ever match. She'd eaten hermit crabs, not as research specimens to be measured and catalogued, but as survival, as the difference between living and dying. She'd watched tides not with instruments and data sheets, but with the visceral knowledge that miscalculation meant going hungry. She'd become, temporarily, not a scientist studying nature, but a part of nature, subject to its rules and rhythms in the most fundamental way possible. 3 months after her rescue, in February when Alaska's winter darkness was slowly giving way to returning daylight, Melissa returned to teaching at Oregon State University. Her first lecture back was to an auditorium so packed that students sat in the aisles and stood along the walls, drawn by news coverage of her ordeal. She'd been profiled in National Geographic, invited to speak at survival conferences and marine biology symposiums, and offered multiple book deals from publishers wanting her story. She declined most opportunities, preferring to focus on her research and her students, though she did agree to write a paper about sustainable foraging strategies for peer-review publication in a survival medicine journal. Her lectures had changed fundamentally, though. She spoke with a raw authenticity that captivated her students, sharing insights about the interconnectedness of marine ecosystems that came from lived experience rather than textbooks. When discussing tide pool food webs, she could describe not just the scientific relationships between species, but what it felt like to depend on those relationships for survival. When teaching about kelp forest ecosystems, she included practical information about which species were edible, how to identify safe versus toxic varieties, how to process them for maximum nutrition. Her teaching evaluations, which had always been good, became exceptional. She did accept one invitation that spring, to return to the island with a documentary film crew, a small production company that wanted to film her revisiting the site of her ordeal. In April, as spring transformed Alaska's southeastern coast, as days lengthened and temperatures climbed toward tolerable levels, Melissa stood once again on the rocky outcrop where she'd signaled her rescue. The documentary crew filmed her walking through the locations that had become sacred to her through their association with survival. The cave where she'd sheltered from the storm, the tide pools where she'd harvested hermit crabs, the trees where she'd hung her vine net. The net itself was gone, torn away by winter storms as she'd expected, but evidence of her 28 days remained if you knew where to look. The cave still showed soot marks from her fires, black stains on the rock ceiling that would persist for decades. The trail markers she'd built from white stones still pointed toward the freshwater seep, though some had been scattered by weather and animals. The SOS she'd painted on rocks with charcoal was fading but visible, the letters still discernible from the air. The documentary crew used drones to capture aerial footage, showing the island's topography and its isolation, emphasizing how remote and dangerous her situation had been. "I don't feel angry about what happened," she told the interviewer during a filmed conversation, sitting on a fallen log with the ocean visible behind her through the trees. That probably sounds strange, and maybe it's some kind of psychological coping mechanism, but it's true. This island taught me things about resilience and adaptation that I'd been teaching conceptually to my students, without truly understanding the reality beneath the concepts. Every hermit crab I ate, every night I survived the cold, every problem I solved with limited resources, those experiences made me a better scientist and a stronger person. They gave me perspective on what really matters. The interviewer asked whether she'd ever return to Alaska for research, whether the trauma might make that impossible. Melissa smiled. "I'm planning a research trip for next summer," she said. "Different location, better planning, satellite communications, and emergency beacons that don't rely on a single point of failure. But yes, I'll come back. This place is part of me now. You can't spend 28 days fighting to survive somewhere without developing a relationship with that landscape. It's not romantic, it's practical and often brutal, but it's real in ways that most human experiences aren't anymore." The documentary aired that fall on a major cable network, drawing strong ratings and renewing public interest in Melissa's story. But her favorite outcome from the media attention came afterward, when she received hundreds of emails and letters from viewers. Many were from students considering careers in marine biology or environmental science, inspired by her combination of scientific knowledge and practical survival skills. Others were from people facing their own survival situations, not stranded on islands necessarily, but battling terminal illnesses, navigating financial crises, recovering from personal tragedies, dealing with addiction or homelessness or other forms of desperate circumstances. They wrote that her 28 days gave them hope that human beings could endure far more than they believed possible, that survival was achievable even when the odds seemed impossibly stacked against success. Melissa responded to as many messages as she could, spending hours each week crafting thoughtful replies, always emphasizing the same core message. Survival isn't about being fearless or superhuman or possessing special abilities that others lack. It's about breaking impossible situations into manageable problems, applying whatever knowledge and resources you possess to each problem individually, and maintaining hope even when logic and statistics suggest hopelessness is more rational. It's about building nets from vines when you have no rope, eating hermit crabs when you have no other food, finding caves when you need shelter, and believing that somewhere beyond the immediate horizon, rescue might be coming if you can just survive long enough to receive it. She kept a small jar on her office desk at Oregon State, containing empty hermit crab shells collected from that Alaskan island, not as trophies of survival, but as reminders of the fundamental truth she'd learned through 28 days of intimate contact with nature's indifference. When students asked her about the hardest part of her ordeal, expecting her to describe the storm, or the cold, or the hunger, she always gave the same answer. "The hardest part was believing I deserved to be rescued, that my life was worth the enormous effort that survival required. Every day I chose to live, instead of giving up, was an affirmation that I mattered, that my existence had value." That sounds philosophical, but it was intensely practical. If I didn't believe I was worth saving, I wouldn't have done the work to save myself. Frank Walters still captains the Pacific Dawn out of Sitka, now with a small brass plaque mounted in the wheelhouse commemorating the rescue. "In this vessel's service to Alaska waters, we have been privileged to save lives. Never hesitate to alter course for those in need." April 1985, November 2025. He occasionally receives letters from Melissa, usually around the anniversary of the rescue, updating him on her research and her life, and thanking him for making the decision to investigate those flares. He keeps the letters in a waterproof box with other mementos from his 4 decades at sea, photographs of notable catches, commendations from the Coast Guard, a compass his grandfather brought from Norway, small reminders that commercial fishing involves not just harvesting resources, but sometimes serving as the thin line between survival and death for those who venture into Alaska's unforgiving waters. The unnamed island remains on nautical charts, exactly as it was before Melissa's ordeal, still unmarked with any special designation, still largely ignored by passing vessels that give its treacherous rocks a wide berth. But for those who know its story, for the students Melissa teaches and the people she inspires through her speaking and writing, it represents something far more significant than just another rocky outcrop in Alaska's vast southeastern archipelago. It stands as a monument to human persistence, to the power of knowledge applied under extreme pressure, to the value of scientific thinking in crisis situations, and to the fundamental truth that survival sometimes depends on unlikely combinations. Academic training and primitive techniques, careful planning and desperate improvisation, hermit crabs and vine nets, and the unwavering belief that rescue, however improbable, remains possible until the very end. Today, Dr. Melissa Grant continues her research on kelp forest ecosystems, now with a perspective few marine biologists possess. She has experienced these ecosystems not as an outside observer, but as a dependent participant fighting for survival. She publishes papers, mentors graduate students, serves on conservation committees, and lives a life that looks from the outside much like it did before her 28 days on an unnamed island. But everything has changed in ways both subtle and profound. She understands now that the ecosystems she studies aren't abstractions or research subjects, but living systems capable of sustaining human life if approached with knowledge and respect. She knows that survival is always possible until it isn't, that the difference between life and death often comes down to small decisions made under pressure, that human beings are simultaneously far more fragile and far more resilient than we generally acknowledge. And on certain nights, when sleep proves elusive and her mind wanders back to that island, she can still taste the bitter flavor of hermit crab meat, can still feel the cold that penetrated to her bones despite the fire, can still hear the wind screaming through the spruce forest during the storm. These memories don't traumatize her anymore. They remind her of what she learned about herself when everything comfortable and familiar was stripped away. She survived 28 days, not through luck or miracle, but through methodical application of knowledge, through refusal to surrender to despair, through thousands of small acts of persistence that accumulated into continued existence. That knowledge, hard-won through suffering and hunger and cold, remains with her always, a foundation of strength she can draw upon whenever life presents new challenges that seem insurmountable.